Hello everyone, I am Professor Paul Carrier, and what I'd like to do now is to talk about another contract formation issue, the issue of the element of acceptance. We are still in the area of formation. Contracts formation is where we began, and last time we discussed an offer, the element of offer, and its three components. This time, well, in fact, let me remind, with the offer there had to be a current intent. That offer had to be properly communicated somehow so an offeree knew about it, and there has to be some level of definiteness of terms. And when you have all of those components satisfied, you can then feel confident that an offer has been made. This time we talk about the acceptance. So the offeror makes an offer, the offeree hears that offer, reads that offer, and then decides whether or not to communicate an acceptance. And acceptance as well has three components, and they are roughly equivalent. Again, there's a current intent. I agree, I'll pay $500, would be a current intent acceptance. Can I have a week to think about it is not yet an acceptance, okay? The second component of an acceptance is that it has to be communicated. The offeror needs to know somehow that the offeree has accepted. And it could even be by an agent. If the offeree told the business manager of the person who made the offer, that would probably be enough for acceptance. And so there may be some factual problems with how something is communicated, but it doesn't have to be direct in hand. It could be by phone. Anyway, the third component, and this is maybe a little bit different than the counterpart component in the offer. Remember, the counterpart for that one was sufficient definiteness of terms. Similar, but you will use different language, and what you'll talk about is the appropriate level and definiteness of the acceptance, and we like to talk about it in two ways. First is the mirror image rule. In the old days, and if the offeror now requires it, the offeree, to have a proper acceptance, has to track exactly what the offeror expects. If it's, you can accept on Friday, but you have to stand on your head and wear red socks. If the offeror demands that and the offeree does not do that, then there is no acceptance, okay? And that's the concept of the mirror image rule, which we will get into as well when we talk about battle of the forms in another session. More commonly, or more appropriately today, if the offeror does not demand a specific way of accepting, then chances are close enough is fine. If most of the terms are agreed to, if the offer's by email and the acceptance comes by fax, that's probably okay, unless the offeror demands that the acceptance has to come by email. And so we like to use the term responsive. Do the terms and does the manner of the acceptance track reasonably closely to what the offeror is expecting? And so it might be a little different a day later. If it's a big deal, no acceptance. If it's not a big deal, then it is still responsive. And now we have that coalescence of the offer and the acceptance. So to go back again really quickly, the components of the second element of formation: acceptance, current intent, properly communicated, and I'd like to say responsive, but don't forget that you may have to deal with, and especially in the past, or if the offeror demands it, the mirror image rule. The offeror might say, these are the terms, no changes, accept it or walk away. And you have to mail it to me by Friday, or it has to reach my hand and I have to read it by Friday. If the offeror demands that, then you have to follow the mirror image rule, which is exact match between what the offeror expects the acceptance to look like and how it's delivered, and in fact how it reaches the offeror. Okay? Now for a few minutes I'd like to talk about some of the main issues of which you would want to be aware. Okay? First, and this in a way ties into the idea of the mirror image rule versus the responsive idea of an acceptance. The offeror is the master of the offer. And so if the offeror specifies how acceptance may be done, then that is the way it must be done, or there is no acceptance, okay? And that goes back to the rule where if the offeror wants to control every facet of how the acceptance must be orchestrated, then the offeror may do so. It's when the offeror doesn't really care so much, then we talk about responsive, okay? So the offeror is the master of the offer, and if he or she or it decides how the acceptance must be handled, both its terms and as well as its delivery, its communication, then the offeror is free to do that, and an acceptance that doesn't track that exactly would not be effective, okay? Again, if it's not all that clear and you're talking about contemporary factual scenarios, you probably want to favor the responsive idea. And let me give you an exam tip. Let's say you're talking about recent contract, not a long time ago. The offeror doesn't seem to require absolute specificity of terms. You should probably use responsive as your third component of acceptance. Yes, the offeree's acceptance, quote unquote, was properly responsive. It contained most of the important terms just as the offer expected. It was delivered in a reasonable way, and the offeror did not expect anything different. Here's the exam tip. You might want to mention as well, for more points or to show that you have a better understanding, and perhaps parenthetically, had the offeror specified clearly the terms of the acceptance or how it must be communicated, how it must be handled, orchestrated, then we probably have to apply the mirror image rule. Okay? So mentioning responsive, and that's the default, I'd say now. But mentioning the mirror image rule doesn't apply here, but it could, probably gets you more points on an exam. Okay? Let's see. Now let's talk about unilateral versus bilateral contracts. If the offeror expects performance, paint my garage, then that's a unilateral offer and can only be properly accepted by the painting, not by a promise to paint. Okay? I want you to paint my garage, and once it's done, come to me for payment. If it's not done, go away. If you start but don't finish, I will not pay you. I'm paying you to show me, to give me the finished product. Okay? I'm looking for performance, not any kind of promise. Okay? Now, that's unilateral. The other one is bilateral, and that's where parties exchange promises. I promise to pay you $3,000 if you promise by the end of summer to paint my garage in a truly professional manner. Okay? So there's a promise for a promise. That makes it a bilateral offer, a bilateral acceptance. Okay? And when those merge, it's a promise for promise bilateral contract. There's a default rule if it's not particularly clear, if the offeror does not make clear that he expects performance, or if she expects a promise, then generically it is probably reasonable for the offeree to accept either way. Okay, paint my garage by the end of summer. And that might mean promise me you will, or it might mean get it started soon so it'll be done. And either one would probably be appropriate if the offeror has not made clear that how. Okay, so remember unilateral and bilateral. Why is that important? Well, several reasons, including how the offeror expects the offeree to accept. But think about this. If the offeror wants performance, not a promise, then the offeree has to perform. And if the offeree does not perform, the offeror does not have to pay. But remember, the offeree has not made a promise. So the offeror could not sue the offeree for breach. So, for example, paint my garage by the end of summer. It's August and you haven't started painting, I'm going to sue you. We can't, because in a unilateral contract, performance is the trigger and there's no promise behind it. Compare that to a bilateral contract. I promise to pay if you promise to paint. If the other side doesn't do the painting, he or she has breached the promise to paint, and now that is legally actionable, leads to breach, and then could lead to damages. Okay, so the idea behind unilateral, bilateral, performance versus promise is an important distinction. that, if you're not careful, can very easily trip you up, particularly on a multiple choice question. Okay? And that's it for today. And we'll follow up this with more formation issue. There will be about 7 installments on contract formation where we begin this journey of contract law. And offer was the first element in the first week. The acceptance will take 3 or 4 weeks before we finish with all of its important aspects.